Okay. Fantastic. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this third installment of the Africa-India Global Dialogue Series titled Mining for Tomorrow: Critical Minerals, Sustainability, and Value Creation. I am Mahau, Senior Technical Advisor at the African Union Development Agency's Africa Policy Bridge Tank, a program that leverages the knowledge produced by think tanks into actionable insights for policymakers, with the ultimate goal of having evidence-based policymaking. And to that end, this collaboration with CSEP will culminate into a policy paper taking into account your insights for both African and Indian policymakers. Ladies and gentlemen, without taking up more time, please allow me to make way for my principal, Kosi Talosi, who will deliver his opening remarks. Over to you, Kosi.
Thank you, Maho. Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, and value partners. I'm Kosi Tulasi, Head of Industrialization, Trade, Market, and Economic Analysis at AUDA-NEPAD. It's an honor to welcome you to this pivotal discussion on mining for tomorrow: critical mineral sustainability and value creation. These webinars form a crucial part of the Africa-India Global Dialogue Series, which exemplify the deepening synergy between our two regions in confronting global challenges and leveraging emerging opportunities. As we embark on a transformative journey toward a sustainable future, the demand for critical mineral is escalating at an unprecedented pace. These essential resources are at the heart of clean energy technology, powering everything from electric vehicle to renewable energy system. However, we must critically ask ourselves, how can we ensure that this rising demand translates into sustainable economic growth, industrial advancement, and shared prosperity, not just for Africa, but for India as a partner as well? With Africa endowed with a rich tapestry of green mineral, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the continent stands at the forefront of global energy transition. As articulated in the African Green Mineral Strategy, this strategy is not merely a framework, it is a blueprint for transformative change, guiding Africa away from the traditional paradigm of raw mineral extraction toward integrated value chain that prioritize local beneficiation and sustainable practices. Today, our discourse should center on strategies that enable us to harness Africa's mineral wealth for greater good. We must focus on fostering local beneficiation, enhancing technology transfer, and establishing responsible mining practices that directly contribute to our socio-economic development. And addressing challenges like infrastructure gaps, skill development, and regulatory coherence in paramount to ensuring that our resources serve as a catalyst for broad-based economic empowerment and societal well-being. At AUDA-NEPAD, we resolutely committed to advancing policies to position Africa as a more than a repository of raw material. We envision a future in which Africa leads the charge in the critical mineral value chain, driving industrial growth, creating jobs, and building a resilient economy that withstands global fluctuation. This vision requires robust partnership with nations like India, focused not only on trade and investment, but also on co-developing policies, technology sharing, fostering industries that yield mutual benefits. To address the aforementioned challenges, AUDA-NEPAD has developed a program in collaboration with Africa Development Bank, ADB, African Union Commission, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Africa Mineral Development Center. This program, called Continental Extractive Program, is implemented through 5 projects. The first one is Africa Mining Vision Capacity Development. The second, Value Chain Development for ASME sector. The third one, Continental Extractive Industrialization Hub. The fourth one, which is Africa Mineral Vision Extractive Industry Project Pipeline. And the last one, which is Research Development Innovation Linkages. This, I would say, gathering is not just a discussion, it is a clarion call for action. We must build frameworks that create equitable partnership, unlock innovative opportunities, and establish sustainable models that drive value creation at every stage of the mining and energy transition. I wish to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished panelists for their contribution today and to our co-host, the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, whose collaboration has been invaluable in making this discussion possible. I look forward to the profound insight that will emerge and, most critically, to the actionable steps that will follow. Thank you, and I'm eager for our collaborative journey toward a sustainable and prosperous future. Thank you, and I wish you all a thought-provoking and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Kosi, and for already putting at the heart of our conversation the importance of this Africa-India partnership and what it should mean for both the continent and for India, and that ultimately it must result in mutual benefit for us all. Ladies and gentlemen, the significance of critical minerals cannot be overstated. This has always been the case, but also as the world accelerates its transition to clean energy, minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths have created a new scramble for Africa. Now, as mentioned by Kosi, Africa, home to vast reserves, stands at the center of this historic and new global race. And India, with its growing demand for these resources, is emerging as a key partner. The question before us today, however, is how can we ensure that this partnership fosters not just resource extraction, but industrialization, value addition, and sustainable development? To that end, our discussion today will explore how Africa and India can collaborate to build a responsible, transparent, and sustainable critical minerals value chain, what policy frameworks are needed to maximize local beneficiation, workforce development, and regional integration, and how technology and perhaps even research collaborations can drive innovation in mining, governance, and sustainability. To help us navigate these pressing issues, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts who will bring invaluable perspectives from governance, industry, and international partnerships. These are Dr. Veda, an associate fellow at the Center at CSEP, and we are joined by Christian Giraud, Neema, and we are also joined by Dr. Alicia Ndlovu, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town. But their impressive bios in full are posted in the chat box. And now, before we dive into our moderated discussion, I will first invite our panelists to provide their initial reflections on today's topic. With that, let me turn to the first panelist for their opening remarks. Dr. Veda, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mahal. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kosi, for setting the stage and sort of setting up the canvas for us. My comments today are going to be based on a paper that is recently released at CSEP. It's called India, Africa, and Critical Minerals Towards a Green Energy Partnership. The big idea that the paper tries to convey is that Africa is central to India's energy transitions for reasons that Mohau, you spoke about and Kosi mentioned too as well. And like many parts of the world, demand for critical minerals in India is projected to increase fourfold by 2030. What this means for us is that domestically, there's a series of policy reforms that are being adopted to boost exploration and mining. But it also means that we're starting to engage very proactively with mineral-rich geographies overseas. It is in this discourse that the paper situates Africa. It sort of understands and begins with the argument that India already has ongoing existing energy relations with several countries in the continent. So going forward, it tries to imagine what are 9 possible policy pathways through which we can build on these engagements as we imagine a critical mineral, sustainable, meaningful cooperation. Essentially, the message that the paper has for the African agency is that beyond the Indian government and the big industry, the India option for African governments who are seeking to advance up the value chain involve a wide spectrum of other stakeholders: research laboratories, mid-sized refineries, recyclers, small-scale companies, even technological startups. I'm happy to talk about this more in detail later, but I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to be part of this panel. And among other things, I'm really excited to see what the panelists think about these 9 policy pathways that we've sort of laid out. And maybe let me know if I was being too ambitious in imagining them up. But I'll start with that. Thanks, Mahal.
Yes. Dr. Christian Jero-Neema, my apologies for tripping over your title there. You have such an impressive resume and we wear so many different hats. I wasn't sure which one to pull out. But just to correct that Dr. Christian Neema is the Africa editor of the China Global South Project, amongst many other things which are, again, in the bio. Over to you, Christian.
Mao, thank you for having me. Quick correction, I'm not Dr. Edless, not yet, but I'm a China-Africa expert and also an expert on critical minerals, following everything that's happened in that on the continent. And thank you for having me for this discussion that really comes in a very timely moment, given that we are at the heart of that debate happening on the continent. And India, as a latecomer coming into the debate, comes in a moment where there is a huge demand for diversification from different stakeholders on the continent, different producing countries. When you look at those countries, we look into one dominant country being China, and we're also looking into how the geopolitical landscape of critical minerals in the world is putting a pressure on producing countries to look for different partners to be able to diversify the supply chain in a way that when the geopolitical war that's happening takes a certain toll, no one's find itself stuck on the losing side. Everyone wants to have different options on the table. And India coming to the debate really comes at the moment where there is that demand for diversification. But India coming at that exact moment also comes with all its own challenges, given that India doesn't have a strong mining background in general, and second, a not strong mining background in Africa as well. So how to address those challenges? How to address the fact that India doesn't have the same historical approach, historical relationship that other great powers do have on the continent, and in that crucial moment of geopolitics, because those connections will play a role into how to address the demand and how to balance the geopolitical tension that we do have and we do see on the continent. We also going to see on how India is going to address the local demand for transformation, local processing that's happening on the ground, because India coming in right now, it's not only coming in as a greenfield project or brownfield. It has to come in a moment where they have to address the exact demand for local processing, industrialization, and development that many countries are putting on the table. And all of that now puts one big question for me on the table, is like how to address the issue of time horizon asymmetry, because the geopolitical tension puts in the context where India and other great power countries, they already have a certain level of economic advancement, industrial advancement, which many African countries do not have. Which it puts on the table the fact that they do have two different time asymmetry, where African is looking on the long term into building its own industrial landscape, building its own development. India and other great countries, they do have the need to secure right now the access to critical minerals. So which now pose the question like how those two partners are going to address a time horizon asymmetry, which also going to lead us to an agenda asymmetry. So this is the thing that I think we should be talking about as well in this discussion, that's going to help enlighten the debate for India policymakers and African-led stakeholders. I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to go too much into the details, but I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Christian. Dr. Ndlovu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hau, and good afternoon to everybody. I think it's really a great honor to be part of this important discussion. I think as someone who is deeply invested in political accountability and resource governance in Africa, my position is simple. I think that the success of any critical mineral partnerships must not be measured only by these, contracts or agreements that will be signed or the tons exported, but by the tangible impact on citizens in all partnering countries. Because we have seen the story before, right? In Africa's case, we have the vast natural resource wealth that generates immense profits for global markets, while leaving many local communities impoverished, governments unable or struggling with mismanaged revenues, economies that are vulnerable to price fluctuations. And so while today's push for green minerals promises a different future, the risk remains the same, being trapped in a cycle of extraction without transformation. So that is why I believe that this discussion must also go beyond securing supply chains to asking deeper questions about economic agency, citizen engagement, and sustainable industrialization in all partnering countries, India and the various countries in Africa that all have different political configurations, which really impacts how also India, devises its own strategies to secure minerals from this continent. So I look forward to discussing these issues, of course, and I believe all of us here are quite committed to working towards a future where, global South countries, including, countries in Africa, use their critical minerals to drive not just the global energy transition, but also a just and inclusive, a transformed economy for all its people. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all our expert discussants for those inspiring opening remarks that have served as appetizers that have, I'm sure, whetted all our appetites for this exciting discussion. To everyone joining in, please remember that there will be a question and answer session in which you will have an opportunity to pose a question to any one of our experts. You may also make use of the chat box to post the burning questions that you have along the way. And now to our moderated discussion. And to our expert discussants, I will pose questions to each of you, but please feel free to add your own input to any of the discussants' remarks as you see fit along the way as well. So please do add your input to those that all have been put forward. But for our first question, Dr. Veda, I will start with you to set the scene. That Africa is emerging as a policy priority for India has been very clear to see. Amongst others, India supported the Ezulwini Consensus, an African common position on the United Nations Security Council reform. India supported the admission of the African Union into the G20, and in fact, it took place under the Indian presidency. There has been enhanced diplomatic engagement through frequent high-level visits. India has even opened 16 new diplomatic missions on the continent, raising the total to 46. To set the scene, can you just highlight more of the areas in which Africa and India already have established partnerships?
Yeah, thanks, Mahal. So we have 2 hours, right, for this answer?
Well, I'm going to ask you to keep it to 2 to 3 minutes, please.
2 to 3 minutes. No, essentially, I mean, this is a wonderful question. It's also a big question, right? Because a lot of the India-Africa conversation sort of delve into the historicity of these interactions. Because I think I disagree with Christian. I think he said there's no history for India in the African continent. I would argue otherwise. We have a very, very rich history, especially with countries in East and Southern Africa. So a large part of the beginnings are historical, they're political, and then of course, even in periods of incredible political passivity, we saw, the enterprise kicking in, Indian entrepreneurs, business houses really moving into parts of the continent and keeping up the relationship, at times when there wasn't a lot of political attention paid that way. But what we do see is in the last 10 years, there's been a huge shift in how India is engaging Africa. You see this in narratives that are coming out of the Ministry of External Affairs, of course, but you also see this in the kinds of cooperation that is happening at the subnational level, at the provincial level. Some of the studies I've done earlier, for instance, tracked Indian farmers who were going from Punjab and Andhra Pradesh to places like Gelan in Ethiopia to farm, right? So the India-Africa relationship, it's layered, it's nuanced, it is not meta, and it isn't lacking any context really. And sort of to bring it down to the energy relationships, a lot of the Indian public sector companies have huge investments in Mozambique, for instance, in Nigeria. 10 to 15% of our oil comes from the continent. So there's also a lot of partnerships in the renewable energy phase. The International Solar Alliance, for instance, has over 30 African countries who are members. So even in the energy sphere, there's already things that are happening. There are conversations, there are actionable agreements in place. And to Alicia's point, some remain agreements, but some not, right? Some have actually, you see things happening on the ground. So it is in this context where we have capacity building initiatives that go back to the early 50s, right? Huge frameworks of cooperation. You have, activities across health. You have very visionary programs, which are often talked about. So I'm not going to harp about them again, but which are like basically medical e-facilities and, technological links between hospitals in Delhi and Nairobi, for instance. You have a lot of activity in the agribusiness sector. You have a lot of things happening in the tech sector. So this isn't a conversation about a possibility of cooperation in a realm or in a sector. It is talking about a relationships that is rooted in history, that has political, economic, and all of this context, and energy relationships that exist, and how do we take it to a different domain of expertise, which is critical minerals. Yeah.
Okay, and just to follow on that, Veda, on critical minerals, as you mentioned, you've of course recently published an insightful paper titled India, Africa, and Critical Minerals Towards a Green Energy Partnership, exploring the potential for collaborations between India and Africa in the critical minerals sector. What is the current volume of trade in critical minerals between the two? Which minerals are of interest, and in which industries are they finding use in India?
I mean, let me just sort of cycle back a little bit and give you a little bit of the context, what's happening domestically, because this conversation or this policy discourse is very much in its nascency. For instance, which minerals are we interested in? Let's just take top three: lithium, nickel, cobalt. We're 100% dependent on these, import dependent on these minerals, right? So that could be a start. But when we looked at agreements, and India has around 9 mineral agreements that I've tracked with countries in Africa, those are at the MOU level. So we don't really know what's happening beyond these agreements being signed. Indian energy companies, mining companies, mid-scale and large mining companies have made their investments or acquired assets in certain countries. But again, we don't really know about any of the processing that happens, or even if the mines are operational and if work has really begun. But to give you a sense of what I mean by this conversation being nascent, is that it was only in 2023 that the Indian government identified 30 minerals that are critical for the economy. In 2024, the finance minister at the union budget talked about or announced the nation's critical mineral mission. And it was only 2 months ago in January 2025 that the National Critical Mineral Mission was announced, right? And there is a PSU called Kabil that has gone on and acquired stakes in Argentina, 5 blocks in a lithium mine in Argentina. There's also been recent reports of India acquiring stakes in Zambia, over 9,000 kilometers in Zambia, and also about how the Geological Survey of India has been deployed in the Congo, in Zambia, and Tanzania to support activities in exploration and surveying. So all of these agreements are very much at the beginning stages. So that's exciting about it, but also that's a space that we should be watching out for. So only to say that a lot of this conversation is actually happening in the realm of possibility, right?
It also sounds like it's happening in the present, that Africa is on the lips of Indian policymakers right now.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why, I mean, just to sort of end, and that's why the approach that we've taken in this paper isn't that India needs these minerals, Africa, do you have those minerals? How do we get them? The conversation isn't extractive at all. The idea is we understand that at a regional, national, continental level, there's a vibrant conversation happening in the continent on what your priorities are when it comes to critical minerals. And the question really is, India, like Kristen mentioned, who's a latecomer, with its very many limitations, how can we meaningfully, substantively contribute to this conversation? Can we actually imagine partnerships that are based on the resources that we have? So yeah.
Okay, excellent. I think that's actually a very good segue to move on to you, Christian. The subject of critical minerals, especially as it relates to Africa, is often not only an economic one, it is also a very political one. One often marred by perceptions of resource extraction with very little value addition or local beneficiation on the continent. My question to you, as someone who has researched mining cooperations between African countries and other regions, is why does this perception tend to dominate the discussion? What has the legacy of extractive industries been on the African continent, also to set the scene?
The reality is for so many years, African countries have inherited in a very extractive mining industry, coming from the colonial time, where Africa, for many African countries, were just huge open pit mine for colonial powers. Like, you go to DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and everything. The idea was never been like to build those countries in a way that they become powerhouses, economic development, industrial country. They wanted them for the mining, for the minerals they do have. So there was not really an idea on how to build a sustainable, long-term mining and industries in those countries. So when those countries gained independence, the elites kind of took over the same idea, the same philosophy, and starting really just to continue with the extractive industry. And of course, when we also take into account the fluctuation of an international market, price of different minerals along the years, many countries just realized it was not economically viable to invest into transformation and processing, given that there was no investment coming into in those countries, and also given that many countries were just going through political instability, wars, and everything. So the conditions were just not there. Was just not there for countries at that time to think of like long-term processing transformation that can happen. So the idea was really much more into extraction. Later on, when we saw a relatively political stability starting to settle in on the continent, when we saw the wave of democratization happening, the reform happening in many African countries, now the debate becomes like, how do we take advantage, given the current circumstances, to start building our own mining industry, to start building the long-term sustainable mining industry? So I think it's a discussion that it was long. We started late to have that discussion, but I think it's timely right now. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, we are late into the discussion. But this is the very basic background to understand why, for so long time, extractive approach has been at the heart of the mining industry in Africa, which is very unfortunate.
And what lessons can be drawn from these experiences to make sure that regarding India, then we do shape equitable and mutually beneficial mining partnerships. And I invite you all to chip in where you can in this discussion.
Yes, I'm gonna be taking the word from Dr. Alicia. Talk about what not sustainability but accountability, and this is the part I think that we need now to integrate in our mining industry in Africa, because for so long we've missed that element of integrating local communities in the discussions, to think about how do we see local communities being developed in the long term through mining investment. When we talk about mining investment, it's the discussions happening in the capital city, where big mining companies talk with national government and do not integrate local communities in part of the discussion. I understand that the idea of integrating them can be politically difficult and challenging, because given the social diversification of many African countries, you cannot guarantee that if you integrate everyone, you're going to have a fruitful discussion. You can have discussion that will not stop. And I understand that the temptation to say we're going to stop everything at the national government, at the national level, without integrating people from the provincial or local level. But we need to find the way now to have all of them in the same way, on the same table, to have those discussions in a way that there's no disruption between what mining companies are doing and the way also local communities are perceiving and expecting those mining companies to invest in the local communities. And this is the part I think that, as Dr. Alicia mentioned, that there is a need to put in place mechanism that allows those the communication to happen, accountability to happen, transparency to happen, in a way that in the discussion of critical minerals, local communities do not find themselves just left with big holes in the ground, minerals being taken away, big industry being built, but no employments, health issue problem, pollution issues happening. So we need to address all of that. And I do believe that there is a need of local accountability and transparency that needs to take place among big mining industry, national government, and local communities as well.
Yeah.
And I think that India should be able, with Indian experience being a federal state, having those decentralization approach, I think they can also bring that experience on the ground on how to address local governance in those issues.
Okay, Dr. Ndlovu, as the mining governance and accountability expert, really the expert in this particular field, this question, what have African negotiators gotten wrong in negotiating mining cooperation agreements in the past, and what should they be asking for when engaging in mining cooperation agreements with foreign entities?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky situation, and I think this is where India's strengths might come in, given the fact that it's very clear that coming into this global debate very late, but also perhaps having insufficient knowledge, as you've mentioned in your paper, Veda, in terms of Africa's interests or agendas. I think what's really important is to then think back to the shared colonial histories, struggles for independence, and the democratic ethos. That's quite important. That's something that, we know India to be one of the largest democracies in the world, but it's also experiencing its own domestic challenges. The struggles that India has domestically, economically, are quite similar to many African countries. You have a growing population, growing unemployment, the economy sometimes struggles to create jobs. These are some of the, struggles that African countries have. So my interest, as someone who's been really interested in the governance of natural resources, is that, Africa's agency has to go beyond just, this idea that we are going to focus on critical minerals. It has to be holistic agency because the fundamentals remain the same. Historically, the continent has struggled to consolidate its democratic institutions. It has struggled to actually ensure that development, is even, right? So meaning that right now, the same questions have been asked since independence. We are still asking the very same questions. What is the key issue here? I would say that the problem is, the real missing piece, right, in this critical minerals governance is quite clear. Enforceable mechanisms that guarantee that mining wealth translates into visible improvements in daily life are missing. And this, of course, there are various issues we can talk about from national government level in terms of our own democratic institutions or state institutions, all the way to the sectoral level, right? People from Zambia will tell you that civil society has fought many times to say that they wanted those contracts to be made public, right? And that has been a struggle. So there are many issues here in terms of accountability, where our own governments have to actually decide that transparency is a key thing. We've got many tools. Not all countries are signatories, for example, in Africa to the EITI. It's just a basic example. Countries choose if they want, to be part of it or not. So without stronger, I think, political accountability and active citizen oversight, where citizens, by the way, because we know this industry to be, quite, for an average citizen, it can be quite mysterious because people don't really know how the sector works. Without actually bringing that knowledge and awareness in very simple terms through clear reporting, etc., and ensuring that the political economy of information in this industry is accessible, we are going to have problems, and and the revenues, for example, will continue to disappear into elite networks rather than benefiting broader populations.
Well, thank you so much for that. Kosi, I'm sure you're coming in to provide us those framework and infrastructure gaps that particularly address the shortfalls that Alicia has just identified.
Yeah, thank you, Mao. For me, just to kind of give a brief on the African Green Mineral Strategy. And also raise the question, when we talk about critical mineral, who is it critical for? Is it for Africa or other developing or developed countries? So we need to be very, very careful where we stand when we say critical mineral. Is it all the minerals are critical for Africa when you talk about economic security, because we need them to develop? So then become critical for us. For others like India that highlighted 13, that's fine for them. But also we need to assess that from the perspective of Africa, what is critical for us. And I'll say for industrialization purpose, all the minerals are critical for Africa. So coming back to the just approved and by the Assembly of African Union Head of State and Government on the African green mineral strategy, we need to look into 4 pillars that are clearly defined in that, which the first one, which is advancing mineral development, is a very important to kind of, we talk about geological knowledge and conducting feasibility study. That's aligned to our program in AUDA-NEPAD with our pipeline of project in the mineral sector. And also the second pillar, which is about developing people and technical capability. That's where we fall short, and we don't know what is underneath. We see it, but we don't know what the ground holds for us, because we never been able to do the geological survey of most of the country. For instance, DRC, they are only 19%. They don't know this at 81% of the land hold in terms of mineral resources. So it's important to be able to do that and have the technology and the capability to identify what mineral we have. And also the value chain is one of the things that we grapple with. We don't really understand how to, for instance, achieve equitable resource-based industrialization, which is something that up to today, we talk about industrialization, we never really grasp that in terms of what we require. That's what I was alluding to the question, critical mineral, who is it critical for? And also the last one, which is about mineral stewardship, to be have a responsible guide in terms of looking at the environment. And the last discussion was talking about stewardship, and was talking about the contract and the community. So we need to be transparent in that area to see what the contract holds, what are the in and out of those contracts in terms of exit, and what what are the responsibilities? We look at the social governance aspect of the green mineral transformation, utilization of other material, reuse, recycling. That's very important if you want to keep our environment for the future generations safe and leave a legacy that is enable them to be able to continue where we will be stopping. Thank you, and I'll come later on.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Perhaps then, Veda, this is a good point in which we can ask then, in terms of addressing these pitfalls that Kosi and Alicia have highlighted. What value propositions is India putting forward to African countries? What is a partnership with India bringing to the table in terms of African agency, and that is unique to how it's done business in the critical mineral sector with other partners in the past?
Yeah, thank you, Mahal. I just want to quickly respond to what Kosi said. It's one of the last 1 year of writing this paper. I think one of my favorite top 3 quotations I've heard is from Merit Kitao, who is the interim director of the African Minerals Development Center. And she, at one of the conferences, said, she was asked this question about criticality, right? And she said, criticality is in the eye of the beholder, right? And there's just so many different definitions of what is critical to who. But one of the ways I think when we're discussing in serious measures about an India-Africa cooperation in this realm would be to find what are minerals that are common. And that is, again, an exercise that we do in this paper to try and find minerals that are, from the African Green Minerals document, critical to Africa, and those in India, and to sort of see how do we then build these value chains and sort of work on these minerals specifically. I also want to just point out, and I think it's important to contextualize this, that this entire, all of these issues that we're talking about, the environmental issues, the issues that are facing the mining communities, this isn't specific to Africa. I think it's important to mention that, right? This is true of any producer country or producing state, right? This is a lot of these challenges are faced in mineral-rich countries in India, mineral-rich states in India. And a scholar, Jessica Nung at Princeton, has also done similar work on all of the lithium extraction that's happening in the US and how you see very problematic practices even in developed countries. So I think it's important to put on the table that this is not an Africa problem, this is a mining problem. And now to the question of what does India bring to the table, right? And I think, like I mentioned, there are a lot of things in the realm of possibility that we discuss. But essentially, I'll talk about 3. Kosi already talked about the importance of surveying and exploring. I think, honestly, the Geological Survey of India's role in this, I think, is going to be transformational. This is a very old organization at the 175th year of its foundation this year. So, and this is the first time that we're hearing reports of how the GSI is going to be deployed to countries in Africa to work alongside other partner institutes in these specific countries. Another very exciting thing that I talk about in the paper is the role of these startups, these technological startups. Now, this again is very new in India, the entry of these technology startups in the mining value chain. And essentially what we found when we were writing the paper is that there are these startups in Bangalore and Calcutta who are doing a lot of things across the mining value chain at the same scale, but at a fourth of the cost and without a lot of the environmental, issues in place. So how can these, these tiny organizations who are already working in other countries like Indonesia, in various forms of exploration and so on, how can they be a part of the Indian option that it presents to African countries? And finally, and talking about the private sector, there's also the major infrastructure construction companies, right? And I know when we talk about infrastructure development in Africa, the first Asian country you're going to think about is not India. But the fact remains that these big Indian infrastructure majors are already investing like $130, $180 billion annually across the continent, right? Building transmission lines, hospitals, roads, bridges. So then there is, we see a space where then it's a sort of aligning strategic imperatives with economic imperatives and sort of see how can these companies then try and work with host governments and build mining adjacent infrastructure, which is a priority that's outlined in the African Green Minerals strategy, right? And then finally, the thing about capacity building, again, what Kosi talked about, right? We already have existing frameworks in place. There are MOUs that have been signed between Indian educational organizations and those in Africa. The Indian Institute of Technical Education, IIT in India, the first IIT to go global is the one in Zanzibar, right? So there are many frameworks of cooperation that already exist. Now, I think the idea, and it's already happening, one way is a lot of the interministerial conversations that are happening about how do we sort of, get these guys to work together and speak to each other. Because one of the big problems is there is a lack of coordination across these many ministries. Because as you know, critical minerals isn't just an energy question. It is just isn't an economic question. So it's that. But to your question of what does the India, option bring to the table, there are several, there are many, multiple, 9 to be exact, that we sort of point out in the paper. So yeah, short answer is read the paper.
I will ask you then, Veda, as you point out that your paper does identify 9 policy pathways that align African needs with Indian strengths. And I hope this isn't like asking you to choose which of your children is your favorite, but could you just highlight maybe the most important 3 of those 9? And then we can engage in a discussion around those 3.
Yeah. Sure. And just to be quick, very quick, I think the big question in India and the big task that we've had to do is Africa isn't a monolith, right? It's, it's so different, it's so diverse economically, culturally, socially. So one of the pathways is to say which parts of Africa should we start engaging with? And we have this whole exercise, this mapping exercise that we've done. And we sort of point towards the SADC region and say, maybe start with Southern Africa and the other countries in the SADC region to build relationships with. So the where in Africa question is sort of, I think, interesting. And it's just, again, it's just to start. This is super nascent, super beginnings, but, and I'm sure Kristen has something to say about this. I'm sure he does.
Christian, please go ahead.
No. I read the paper. The paper is very interesting and very rich. It's very rich. It comes with different ideas and the way to look into India's engagement in critical minerals. And she mentioned SADC because when I read the SADC part, I was like, I laughed and I was like, I'm gonna bring it during the discussion because in the paper they went in the direction I would not advise any countries or any stakeholders to engage with Africa in that regard. Few months back, I was in Europe having the similar discussion. I was telling them my point of view is I believe that you should not be engaging SADC country as a grouping countries, and I would always advise to go for a bilateral relationship engagement more than a regional engagement for simple reason. Because the idea in the continent, especially in the SADC, is to say, you know what, we should be pulling resources together to help us address the different issues that we cannot address alone, so we can engage with different partners. But the problem is the idea of pulling resources also comes with the idea of competitions, because when you want two countries to work together, they're all looking into the advantage they're going to make out of that cooperation, especially when you look into the fact that we are under a geopolitical competition context here. So each country wants to take the advantage on its side. So we have the case of the DRC Zambia. They signed an MOE in 2022. It never really left the ground. Why? Because at some point those tensions became a center point of disagreement between Zambians and Congolese to say where we're going to build the value chain, where we're going to build the transformation, the processing entities. They had the DRC Zambia United States agreement. Same thing happened. So just to tell you that, for me, from an African perspective, I would advise Indian policymakers to look into SADC, yes, but to look into a bilateral relationship, to identify one country, to say, we're going to start to engage with one country, because one country is already enough of a challenge to address in these current circumstances. So when you take when you take 2 of them, 3 of them on a multilateral cooperation, you're just making the task much more difficult for India to engage in a very valuable way. So when I read that, I was like, I have to mention that I do believe that SADC, yes, is a good starting point, but it also comes with a lot of geopolitical tension, because SADC has a lot of geopolitical center point and discussion, not only within SADC but also externally. But I would also advise for a bilateral engagement, pick one country and start to engage on a lower level, and say, to grow the relationship, later on to think of extending to another country, into a third and fourth country maybe.
No, thank you so much for that, Christian. I think I will pose this one to Alicia before we head into our question and answer session. Just a reminder to everybody who's logged in that after this question, we will be heading into a question and answer session. You are welcome to raise your hand and we will let you join the discussion. You may also post your question in the chat box, and we already have some. So I'm going to ask you a forward-looking question before we head into the question and answer session, Alicia, because I should think that part of the benefit of having South-South cooperation between Africa and states like India that are rapidly industrializing is that hopefully they're able to share knowledge and experiences so that Africa itself can industrialize. So as Africa seeks to position itself beyond being a supplier of raw materials, what kind of agency is needed to ensure critical minerals drive broader socio and economic development?
A very good question, and I think my answer lies in what Christian was saying now, in terms of saying, I think India should engage countries, should engage in bilateral agreements. I agree and disagree. I think I agree, one, because there are governance issues and these countries are quite diverse. And, but at the same time, I think historically, this is what has gotten us to where we are as the nation. Because the more we engage in these different, bilateral agreements, the more our voice as a region actually weakens. What I think is really important is that countries like India, or any other countries anyway that are interested, it would probably even be more efficient for them, right, if there was some kind of, a harmonized SADC policy. And I think this is the direction which we should be looking at. If it is so difficult to deal with individual countries, then the question we should be asking is, why is it SADC, or any other region for that matter, why is it that internally, before we are approached by any external state, why is it that internally we are struggling to agree? Why is it that when we look at our policies, they're so old and outdated? Why is it that today we are not able to sit around the table and actually agree? And we know the politics of this are quite complex. But if you look at the SADC region, and I think Veda, in the paper, you've identified about 10 countries that you think have the critical minerals that, are strategic for India. Those countries are actually not the same in size economically, but they have some level of dependence amongst each other. Yes, the contributions are also unequal, but I still firmly believe that there is absolutely no way that any country, if you isolate countries and say any country can do it on its own, I still think that Africa would still be trapped. Many African countries would still be trapped, in this historical sort of, extraction mode. And I still believe in partnership and in actually trying to see if we can harmonize our policies. I believe in that, and I think it can be done. But if there is no interest, as you are suggesting, Christian, that India can just simply say we will engage bilaterally, I think that will then make it worse for us, that we will never actually have an incentive, because here it is about political incentives. And that's the key question we haven't answered, right? To say, what are not just economic incentives? What are the political incentives that would get our leaders sitting around the table to discuss this and actually not just worry about, the next elections, because that is actually what's more important. And then moving beyond, maybe just quickly, I think the point that I don't know if it was you, Christian, or it was Kosi, who talked about the time horizon asymmetry.
It's me. It's me
that's
who spoke about that.
Yeah, I think that's actually it's spot on, because Africa's agency will not be defined solely by its ability to extract minerals, but by its capacity to transform that mineral wealth into a foundation for sustainable development. And I think that is true to say that if we are having, you know, the Africa Mining Vision, or the green mineral strategy that's been recently launched, what do we do when countries like India are actually desperate for some of these resources today? And that, for me, is not an answer that a single country in Africa can give. They have to come together.
I don't want to go into the debate of the political economy of the natural resources of each country. That's what motivates me into that. But I'm really happy to have the discussion. Dr. Alicia, I'm going to have the discussion with you later. But yes, I think there is a lot to say about the approach that we should be taking on how we tackle those issues collectively or as a single country.
Okay, thank you. For the question and answer, I'm going to start with the second question, actually, Alicia, which I think ties into the points that you were putting forward. This question is from Amit Jan. His question is that India has not signed up to EITI, and the history of its own mining industry is less than stellar when it comes to protection of environment and society at home. So how much confidence can African countries have in Indian mining firms doing anything better than what they have done at home? I think maybe it goes to the question of what should also African countries be demanding from these partnerships with India then.
And should I answer this question?
I can.
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm going to take on that later.
Okay, if you want to answer Christian, that's fine. But I think it's a very important question. I think when I read the paper that, you know, Veda is presenting to us, this was part of the question I was asking, to say, you know, India, like I in my opening remarks, I said the challenges are quite the same. You know, it's not that India has found the formula to address, you know, the high unemployment that they're experiencing, or, you know, economic ills within that country. And so it does beg the question. But at the same time, I think that's an advantage. You know, these are global South countries that have historically, you know, been trying to develop their nations and to make sure that that development is even. So this, for me, is not actually a weakness. It is a strength, because these countries are coming together with similar interests. They are not necessarily nations that are advanced, way advanced in terms of solving, you know, socioeconomic issues in their nation. So that can be an entry point to say we all have an interest in using these resources as a foundation to promote inclusive and sustainable development.
Okay, thank you. I'll allow you, Christian, just to respond to that in 30 seconds. I'm quite conscious that we're going to run over time. That is an indicator that the discussion is very exciting. But please, just in 30 seconds, because the next question is going to go to you as well.
Basically, for me, no African country should trust Indian or any other company. Simple as that, because you should not be trusting mining companies. It's about governance issues. If you do not put strong regulatory measures and policy on the ground and follow through that are implemented on your countries that you can be India, United States, China, whatever mining companies, you will take the short road, you take the shortcuts by polluting the environment, because it's easy, it's cost effective. So the answer is not about if India has historically background to having that. The question is much more, what's the political landscape we do put in our countries in a way that whether you being India, China, US, any kind of country, when you come, you do abide by the norms and regulation that we put in place so our environment is not polluted. For me, it's that. So we don't really need to worry about whether it's India or another country. It's about us putting the required regulatory on policies on the ground.
Okay. Now, still sticking with you, Christian. Aban Kita's question is, my query is, as China dominates in DRC for cobalt, and now the United States also offering military help to them, and interested in politics of Africa, and also we Indians want to participate in geoeconomics of critical minerals. What strengths does India have against China or any other big power for this?
That's a trick and difficult question. Just for corrections, the US is not offering military help to the DRC. The DRC and the current president is seeking the US is leveraging the US-China competition over critical minerals to get US support against the M23 rebellion that's backed by Rwanda, hoping that the United States will put economic and political pressure on Rwanda to stop its backing by the M23. So what India has as leverage to put on the table, frankly being said, it's really difficult. It's very, very much difficult, given that India doesn't have the political leverage that the US or China has in those countries. It's going really, really difficult for India to pretend that it can compete with the US or China in the DRC under the current circumstances. However, there is one interesting mining project that I'm quite surprised at how Indians funding banking are not trying to support. There is this project called the Chemical of Africa, SHEMAF, which now Norinco, a Chinese mining company, wants to buy. It's an Indian funded project. They want to sell it, but somehow Americans and Swiss company are more interested. Chinese are more interested, by somehow you don't have Indians on the table coming to say, you know what, we're going to put 1.2 billion because what they're asking, we're going to put 1.2 billion on the table to be able to buy back this project. If they do it, they're going to have one of the top 6 big cobalt project in the DRC. But I'm quite surprised to not see a lot of attraction coming out of India for that kind of project. But from a geopolitical perspective, India, frankly thought that it doesn't have enough political leverage to go toe-to-toe or head-to-head with the United States or China in the DRC on critical minerals. It's going to be really difficult.
I quickly
Now
comment now.
Okay, no, please go ahead.
Quickly, I know we're running close, but I just want to say, just domestically in India, I don't think there is a conversation about going toe-to-toe with China or the US or anything in Africa. But I think it's important. There are 2 points I quickly want to make. The conversation on the African agency is very important. But similarly, a dialogue that's happening is on how do we ensure and how do we put guardrails in place for Indian companies going global? Are there, things we can do, laws, for instance, or, even regulatory legal structures? How can they be sort of leveraged to make sure that these companies that are going abroad and, can be at some way held accountable for their actions? The second point that I do want to make is I think it's, again, important to just throw out there that India being part of something like the MSP, the recent joint statement that came out of leaders, the India-US joint statement talks about critical minerals a lot, right? They're talking about a US-India strategic mineral recovery initiative. There's a whole bunch of initiatives that have been announced, all of them talking about, working across the value chain. There is also the India-US-Tanzania Energy Alliance. So there's also the Japanese have indicated interest of working with India. And a lot of this interest from third-party countries come because there's some element of familiarity that these Indian companies have, especially operating in East and Southern Africa or operating in developing country contexts. So there's also that aspect about strategic alliances, perhaps unequal alliances, but alliances nonetheless.
And the last 2 questions. The first one from Adrian Joseph from the South African Institute for International Affairs. Alicia, I'll pose this one to you. What do you think India learned from hosting discussions on critical minerals during its G20 presidency in 2023 that could be helpful for South Africa as it seeks to elevate the issue of critical minerals during its G20 presidency?
So I guess, Adrian, you are asking us, what can we learn from India's presidency in 2023 on critical minerals that could be lessons for Africa as it tries to host this G20? Yeah, this is a very interesting one for Africa. And I think, as we know, at least right now, Africa as a unit is part of the G20. And I think it's a huge responsibility for South Africa in this particular case. I think unlike India, South Africa is quite different in the sense that you are representing a country, South Africa, which is hosting, but also you are in these negotiations with an entire continent, I think, which is something that I think India didn't have to grapple with. So this, I think, places immense a good burden, on South Africa's hosting of this. And actually, this is where I disagree with Christian, where I say this is actually the opportunity where then Africans would have to be sure that they are speaking with one voice. If there was ever a time, I think this would then be the G20, where they begin to analyze those issues to say, can we actually be able to harmonize our policies? Are there areas where we can create hubs and actually be able to negotiate with a stronger voice? I think this G20 presidency for me is unique, Adrian, in that sense, that we not only just have India just hosting or South Africa just hosting, but we have the African Union, or rather, the African Union representing different member states as part of the G20 negotiations. And I think that should then elevate the strategies that African countries have, including that green mineral strategy and everything that is stemming out of the Africa mining vision. It is only this time. I know I sound idealistic and, but I think it's really important. I mean, Veda, you had another webinar previously where, I think, was it Pari that was mapping the different agreements. Even in that sense, we don't have enough information about the different agreements that African countries individually have with the different, competitors around the globe. And I thought that was a very good step, because it will show us that, okay, these are the agreements, what are the interests, are they aligning, and where can Africans, can I mention this one point? I always say to people, when I read about the history of the European Union, because there's always, this, we always criticize the African Union for not being able to implement many of its policies. I once read the history of the European Union, and I saw that at some point when it first started, it was a few countries, and there was a strategic mineral or resource there, which was coal, that those countries were interested in. So meaning that it didn't start very broadly with, come with a list of 30 critical minerals, let's see what we're going to do with them. There is absolutely no way. It's going to be cumbersome. It's going to be a very difficult job to say that we should agree on the 30% reserves that we have in Africa and the different, the diversity of resources, because that is also uneven, right? Countries don't have the same resources or minerals. Some countries are still oil dependent, some are coal dependent. In South Africa, coal is a critical mineral, according to our minister, even though we are in a transition, right? So we need to ask ourselves a question right now with this G20 presidency. Are there particular resources to the eye of the beholder, as Marit would say, that African nations can galvanize around? It cannot be everything. If South Africa says we have manganese, PMGs, this and that, gold, it can't be everything. But we at least need to know with Zambia, with DRC, is it possible to at least get something done, implement something, let us see results? So that's what I think.
Okay. No, thank you. In the interest of time, I am going to combine the last two questions. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I won't open up the floor to any further questions after these two. Alicia and Christian, I will give you 20 seconds each to add your take to these questions that I'm combining. They are from SP and Constantino Xavier. Are there any grassroots movements in Africa that advocate for appropriate social safeguards? What challenges do they face, and what can they leverage to make their voices heard? And in what ways may India's open federal and democratic governance experience then be of interest to state capacity building in African countries? I think those two questions are related, both at a macro and micro level, in terms of building the capacity of African states. I'll be more generous and give you 30 seconds.
So no, African countries are not short of civil society organization advocating for good governance, transparency in the mining industry. They are very much vocal, very much present. We have Zela in Zimbabwe. We have another organization, the DRC in Zambia as well. There are quite a lot of them. The issue they're facing, it's much more governance issues and transparency and the rule of law. The reality is we have rule of law, we have institutions, but those laws to be implemented and as an institution to follow through are different other issues that needs to be addressed. And this is the part where you also have the political economy of each country. That's why I don't want to go back in the debate with Alicia, but the reality is governance, different countries have different political profile that just leave different space for civil organization to be present and to have impact. If, for example, civil society in South Africa will have much more impact in the mining industry than the ones in Zimbabwe or the ones in the DRC or the one in Zambia. So those are the realities that we have to take into account. So yes, we have those local voices present, but we do not have not the state capacity, but we do not have the political landscape that are allowing them to have the impact they need to have on the ground. So that's, I think, for me, what would be the main issue about those civil society organizations struggling to have an impact on the ground, even though they're still making some wins and some victories with mining companies.
Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think Pishan has put it very well here, that it's this diversity of political configurations on the continent that is quite problematic. And I think it's always been the elephant in the room, to say that it's much easier to talk about economic interests than it is to actually talk about, the political diversity and what that means in terms of governing our natural resources. What does it mean when we have to come up with harmonizing our policies when, let's say, some of the states have never had any electoral turnover before, and there's been one political party since, independence. And exactly. Also not just diversity in terms of electoral competitiveness, but in terms of, party institutionalization. We have political parties that are running these countries. Some are, more capable than others. They've got, they're quite entrenched in terms of citizen and party linkages, but it's not the same, and there are advantages to both. Speaking about those time horizons that Christian was talking about, there are trade-offs that we need to actually worry about, because when we talk about mining, which we know that, investing in that industry means that it's a long-term game. It's also, of course, not good for mining companies to have instability in terms of different political parties coming in all the time. However, as citizens of Africa, we obviously want the competition, because in our minds, we assume that that is the only way we can hold our leaders accountable, is if there is some turnover. That turnover is not always good for business, but at the same time, we want to see it. So how do we resolve the trade-off of electoral competitiveness and also needing sustainability in our economies? So I think that is
stability.
Yeah.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the unfortunate end of what I'm sure has been an informative discussion for all of us. I would like to give a very, very special thank you to our expert panelists and invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to please follow them on their social media, where you'll be able to see some of their published work. I also encourage you to get your hands on Dr. Veda's paper, India, Africa, and Critical Minerals Towards a Green Energy Partnership. I thank you so much for your patience. I am aware that we ran slightly over time, but that is only indicative of how robust the discussions have been and all the insights and how rich they were that we've been imparted with here. I would give you just a sincere appreciation for us all, for all of you who tuned in. And again, thank you to our expert discussants. And thank you to both teams from AUDA-NEPAD and CSEP, who are able to bring this webinar every month, where we really share some really great insights for African and Indian policymakers. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to inform you that the next webinar will be on the 25th of April. The flyers will be out in due course, informing you of the topic and the login details. With that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to wish you a very, very wonderful weekend. And thank you so much for tuning in to this installment of the Africa-India Global Dialogue series. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.